December 25, 2003, Cotonou, Benin, 1:59 p.m. A Boeing 727 hits the ocean upside down. 141 bodies recovered, 22 survivors. Total, 163. The manifest said 150. The pilots were told 145. The seats held 140. Nobody counted. Nobody weighed. Boarding passes had no names. 12 of the dead were never identified. How does an airline lose a plane full of people it never bothered to count? To answer that question, we need to start not at an airport, but at a desk inside a travel agency in Conakry, Guinea. That desk was the official headquarters of Union des Transports Africains, UTA. The airline had no offices, no dispatch center, no crew room, no safety department, no board of directors, and no maintenance manuals. Its entire operational footprint consisted of that desk, a rented check-in counter at Conakry Airport, and 2 shipping containers on the airport grounds, one containing a few spare parts for the Boeing 727, the other holding printed paperwork and bottled water. The airline was not so much a company as it was a financial instrument, owned and controlled by a man named Darvish Kasim and his family. Every management position was filled by a family member. None of them had any knowledge of aviation. UTA had not always operated jets. For years it ran small routes across West Africa, using a LET L410 turboprop and a leased Antonov AN-24, ferrying passengers between Freetown, Banjul, and Abidjan, under the name West Coast Airlines. But in 2002, something shifted the landscape of West African aviation entirely. Air Afrique, the transnational carrier that had connected Francophone Africa for decades, went bankrupt, a victim of mismanagement, corruption, and the post-September 11th collapse in air travel. Overnight, direct routes between major West African cities and the Middle East vanished. Air France picked up some of the slack, but its routing was absurd. Flying from Conakry to Cotonou required a stopover in Paris. For the enormous Lebanese diaspora spread across West Africa, businessmen, families, workers who had lived in the region for generations, the disappearance of direct flights to Beirut was an urgent problem. Demand was immediate and intense. And where there is demand and no oversight, there is opportunity for people who do not care about safety. UTA saw that opportunity. In July 2003, the government of Benin granted the airline temporary authorization to operate charter flights on the Conakry to Cotonou to Beirut route. In November, UTA requested an extension to Dubai, known for its duty-free shopping, to boost profitability. The request was granted. But to fly these routes, UTA needed a jet, and the jet they found had a history that should have disqualified it from ever carrying passengers again. The aircraft was a Boeing 727-223, serial number 21370, built in June 1977 and delivered to American Airlines as N865AA. It had spent its first 2 decades flying the American domestic network, Chicago to Dallas, New York to Miami, the kind of routine, well-maintained service that the 727 was built for. Then, in October 2001, American Airlines retired it. The aircraft was flown to the Mojave Desert and parked in the boneyard, where old jets go to bake in the sun until someone scraps them for parts, or, occasionally, pulls them back into service. In January 2003, a Miami-based leasing company called the Financial Advisory Group, FAG, bought the aircraft and sent it on a ferry flight to Afghanistan under a new registration, YA-FAK, for use by Ariana Afghan Airlines. The FAA authorized the ferry flight on one condition. Before the aircraft could carry passengers again, all mandatory airworthiness directives had to be applied. What actually happened to the aircraft in Afghanistan is unclear, because the maintenance records from that period were never produced. By June 2003, the 727 had moved again, this time to Swaziland, re-registered as 3DFAK under a carrier called Alpha Omega Airways. Alpha Omega then leased it to UTA in July. In October, UTA signed a second lease directly with FAG, and the aircraft received its 4th registration in 10 months, 3X-GDO, Guinean. Each re-registration was a fresh coat of paint over the same problem. The aircraft had no verifiable maintenance history after leaving American Airlines. The scale of the maintenance void was staggering. A Boeing 727's last major overhaul, the C-check, had been performed by American Airlines at Tulsa in January 2001, at 64,975 flying hours. After that, the aircraft changed hands 4 times across 4 countries in 10 months. Each new operator was supposed to inherit the maintenance program and continue tracking inspections, component life limits, and airworthiness directives. None of them did. The A-check interval for this aircraft was 65 flying hours. The B-check was due every 475 hours. By December 2003, the 727 had accumulated over 67,000 total flying hours, and more than 1,000 cycles since the last C-check. Yet investigators could not find a single document proving that any scheduled inspection had been performed since the aircraft left Tulsa. When the BEA requested maintenance records from FAG, from Ariana, from Alpha Omega, and from UTA, each entity either pointed to another or produced nothing at all. The aircraft's own logbook, the legal document that must accompany every commercial airplane and record every defect, repair, and inspection, was missing entirely. There were no overhaul documents, no engine hour tracking, no logs. The engines themselves showed evidence of altered serial numbers, masking their true time in service. When the aircraft passed through Lebanon, at some point during this period, Lebanese authorities red-flagged it for being in questionable condition. UTA made the minimum fixes required to get it airworthy, and flew it straight back to West Africa. There were no records of corrective maintenance after that. In fact, there were no records of any maintenance at all. The ownership trail was designed this way on purpose. FAG in Miami, registered in the Virgin Islands, operating through an office in Sharjah, leasing to Alpha Omega in Swaziland, subleasing to UTA in Guinea. Each layer existed to obscure responsibility. Behind all of it was a man named Imad Saba, a Palestinian-American whose name was already familiar to investigators. Saba had been linked to multiple nominal airlines that existed only on paper, designed to operate in parts of the world where authorities lacked the capacity to ask questions. One of his companies had been named by the United Nations for suspected violations of arms embargoes. Another of Saba's aircraft had crashed while allegedly flying aid into Darfur. The pattern was unmistakable: fake paperwork, junk planes, countries with no regulatory teeth, and a business model built on plausible deniability. Guinea was the perfect environment for such an operation. The country had ratified the Chicago Convention, which obligates member states to oversee and regulate their airlines. But Guinea had never actually implemented the convention. ICAO's own 2001 audit stated plainly that Guinea had not established a regulatory mechanism for civil aviation. The country's inspectors were not trained, records were not audited. When UTA submitted an operations manual for approval, the Guinean Civil Aviation Authority, the DNAC, approved it without apparently reading it. BEA investigators who later examined the manual found it had been clumsily copied from other airlines. Sections referenced aircraft types UTA had never owned, the Lockheed L-1011, the Fokker 50, and destinations it had never served. Procedures were lifted verbatim from carriers in Jordan and Gaza. One BEA investigator noted that the most coherent passage in the entire document was a generic statement declaring that safety is the most important rule for all airlines, and that safety is everyone's responsibility. It was the only complete thought in a manual that existed solely to check a regulatory box, in a country that never checked the box. The crew who would fly the aircraft on its final day were products of this system. The captain was a 49-year-old Libyan national named Najib al-Barouni, a former Libyan Arab Airlines pilot with 11,000 hours total and 8,000 on the 727. His commercial license had been issued by the United Kingdom in 1977. He had joined FAG in March 2003 and had been flying for UTA since December 8th, just 17 days. His first officer was also 49, also Libyan, also seconded from Libyan Arab Airlines through FAG. The BEA report could not determine his professional experience because UTA kept no personnel records. The flight engineer, 45, had 14,000 hours, all on the 727. The three of them flew every flight together, alongside 4 cabin crew members, 2 Peruvian ground mechanics, and a transporter, a local fixer who paid expenses in cash at each stopover and smoothed things over with authorities when problems arose. None of them had written contracts. None had established duty limits or rest periods. All were paid in cash. On the morning of December 25th, the 727 arrived in Cotonou from Conakry, carrying 86 passengers, including 3 babies and 10 crew. 9 passengers disembarked. The aircraft was then prepared for the next leg, a short hop to Kufra, Libya, for fuel, then on to Beirut and Dubai. It was Christmas Day. Many of the passengers boarding in Cotonou were members of the Lebanese diaspora heading home for the holidays. Some had traveled from landlocked countries, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, carrying everything they owned. Others brought bags stuffed with gifts for relatives waiting in Beirut. 15 Bangladeshi soldiers returning from United Nations peacekeeping duty in Sierra Leone and Liberia were also on board. Among the passengers was also, according to a United States congressional report, at least one Hezbollah official carrying $2 million in cash that had been raised by supporters of the organization across West Africa. The Lebanese Shiite militant group had long maintained a fundraising network among wealthy Lebanese businessmen in the region, and the Conakry-Beirut route served as one of its financial arteries. This detail, revealed years later, added another layer to an already disturbing picture. The flight was not merely a poorly run charter. It was a node in a web of diaspora economics, political finance, and geopolitical interests. All of it funneled through an airline that could not produce a load sheet. The check-in process was chaos. Airport staff did not assign seat numbers. Boarding passes were issued without names. Seats were sold and resold in the terminal by passengers who had no intention of traveling, scalping tickets to people who were not even booked, like concert seats. The gate area was loud and disordered, children crying, people jostling, and crucially, baggage and passengers being loaded onto the aircraft with no regard for weight or distribution. No one weighed the baggage, no one tracked the passenger count. No one produced a load sheet, not for this flight, not for any UTA flight ever. The Guinean authorities had never required it. What the ground crew did produce was a catastrophe in the cargo hold. Baggage handlers began loading the aft hold, but at some point, an unidentified UTA agent instructed them to continue loading into the forward hold, which was already full. The handlers, who had never received formal training, complied. By the time loading was finished, the forward hold was packed to capacity with the heaviest concentration of weight in the aircraft. This single decision shifted the airplane's center of gravity 5 full percentage points forward, from the assumed 19% of the mean aerodynamic chord to an actual 14%. The crew had no way of knowing this because they had no data, but the physics did not need a load sheet to operate. Here is what a center of gravity shift means in practical terms. Every aircraft in flight is balanced around a point where its weight and its lift intersect. For the airplane to be controllable, the center of gravity must sit within a narrow range, slightly forward of the center of lift. The horizontal stabilizer, the small wing on the tail, provides a downward force that counterbalances the nose-heavy tendency created by this arrangement. Before takeoff, pilots set the stabilizer trim to match the aircraft's weight and CG position. More forward CG requires more nose-up trim. At 19% Mach, the correct trim setting was 6.75 units nose-up. At the actual 14% Mach, the correct setting was 7.75. The crew set 6.75 because 19% was the number they always used, the number from previous flights, the number based on a weight they were guessing and a balance they could not measure. They were off by 1 unit. 1 unit of trim on a Boeing 727 does not sound like much. On this day, at this weight, on this runway, in this heat, it was the difference between flying and not flying. 30 minutes before takeoff, the cockpit voice recorder began capturing what would become one of the most damning transcripts in aviation history. The first officer's voice came through first. "The sheets they gave us don't have the load. What is that? Come on. The sheets they gave us don't have the weight. Only passengers." The captain replied, "Don't worry. We have the passenger manifest without weight." The first officer was not reassured. Each of them is bringing on board the airplane like 200-kilo suitcases. 200 kilos? That's not possible. Get them to unload them and weigh them. Then we will know if we manage to take off." He grew more agitated. "The people, I tell you, it will be quite a performance if we manage to take off today. At least let them put the exact weight so that we know. Let them put the exact weight so we can calculate it." The Director General of UTA, seated on the cockpit jump seat, intervened. "But the weight is indicated there." The first officer shot back. "There is no weight. Each passenger came on board with a 20-kilo bag. That's impossible. You have an airplane with 100 passengers." And then he said the words that would become his own epitaph. "If this airplane takes off today, you will see. If this airplane takes off. Otherwise, we're going to drop into the sea. You will see when the aircraft will take off, or we will crash into the sea." The Director General apologized. He said he would tell management off when they reached Beirut. He said he would send messages limiting baggage to 30 kilograms. He said he could not do anything right now. The first officer tried one last compromise. "No, don't send the passengers back, but the baggage must stay here, on the ground, in Cotonou." It did not stay. Nothing was offloaded. Nothing was weighed. Nothing changed. The first officer had predicted the exact outcome: a crash into the sea, spoken it clearly into a recording device, and been overruled by a system that had no mechanism for listening. Here is the second thing most people do not understand about this accident. The aircraft was not just overweight, it was also fighting the wrong configuration in the wrong conditions. The crew knew they were heavy. They selected a conservative rotation speed of 137 knots, corresponding to a takeoff weight of 187,000 pounds, 15,000 pounds above their declared weight. That was a sound decision. They also shut off the air conditioning to extract maximum thrust from all three engines, also sound. But neither measure addressed the real problem, which was not thrust, it was trim. The aircraft had enough power to accelerate. It did not have enough nose-up authority to rotate at a normal rate with the stabilizer set 1 unit too low. At 13:58, the captain recited a prayer, Bismillah el-Rahman el-Rahim, in the name of God, the most merciful and the most beneficial, and the brakes were released. The 727 began its takeoff roll on runway 24. The first officer was pilot flying. The aircraft accelerated, but slowly. Even the controllers in the tower commented on how long the roll was taking. At 80 knots, the captain called the speed check. At 137 knots, V1 and VR, he called rotate. The first officer pulled back on the yoke. Nothing happened. The flight data recorder showed the elevator input moving from -5.6 degrees to +10 degrees in 2 seconds. The aircraft's angle of attack did not change. The nose stayed glued to the runway. The captain's voice rose. Rotate, rotate. Still nothing. More, more, more. The first officer pulled harder. The angle of attack began to increase, slowly, agonizingly, at roughly 1 degree per second. Pulling the nose up in this configuration was physically possible, but it required approximately 100 pounds of force on the control column, far more than any pilot would normally apply, and far more than would feel safe. For a trained pilot, a sudden, full deflection pull on the controls during takeoff is an alarm signal that something is catastrophically wrong with the flight controls themselves. The instinct is to hesitate, to diagnose, not to yank harder. The first officer hesitated for 1 second too long. 300 meters before the end of the runway, the nose finally began to rise. The aircraft lifted off, barely. It was airborne at perhaps 1 to 2 meters, wallowing in ground effect, not climbing, not accelerating, just hanging. Beyond the runway end, 118 meters past the threshold, sat a concrete blockhouse containing the localizer antenna. It was 2.45 meters tall. It had been built in the 1960s. It did not meet modern ICAO clearance standards, which require such obstacles to be frangible and as low as possible. But Benin could not afford to modernize its airport. The building was still there because no one had the money to move it. The aircraft cleared the runway surface with 1.2 meters of altitude. The building was 2.45 meters tall. At 13:59:11, 70 seconds after brake release, the landing gear struck the roof of the blockhouse. The impact tore the roof off and flung it 9 meters. The right main landing gear ripped away. Parts of the right wing flaps separated. A technician working inside the building was injured by the debris. With the landing gear gone and the flaps damaged, the aircraft lost what little lift it had. It continued forward, descending, clipping the airport perimeter wall with its tail cone, and then slammed into the beachfront beyond the airport boundary. The fuselage broke into 3 sections. The cockpit snapped forward. The tail sheared away. The main body cartwheeled into the shallow water and came to rest upside down. Inside the inverted cabin, passengers who had been sitting, some without seatbelts, some on the floor because there were no seats left, were thrown mercilessly. Some were killed instantly. Others found themselves trapped in an inverted fuselage filling with seawater. The water was shallow, shallower than the height of the fuselage itself. But with the aircraft upside down, it was more than deep enough to drown those who could not orient themselves or free themselves from the wreckage. Most survivors were those who could swim out through the gaping breaches torn into the airframe. Everyone else was trapped. The first officer, the man who had predicted this exact outcome 12 minutes earlier, who had begged for the baggage to be offloaded, who had warned that they would crash into the sea, suffered a fatal head injury when his skull struck the right side of the cockpit during the initial impact. He died in hospital. The captain, the flight engineer, and the director general all survived by scrambling out through holes in the fuselage behind them. The emergency response was painfully slow. Cotonou had no dedicated airport fire and rescue unit capable of handling a crash of this scale. Local fishermen, beachgoers, and civilians were among the first on scene, wading into the water to help. Emergency vehicles became stuck in the sand. Thousands of onlookers crowded the beach, hampering rescuers. Relatives of passengers threw themselves into the sea, trying to recover bodies. Police used belts to push back the crowd. CNN reported onlookers screaming as bodies washed ashore. 141 people died. 22 survived, all with injuries. 5 of the initial 27 survivors later succumbed. 12 bodies were never identified. They had boarded without records of their names. 7 people listed as missing did not match any of the unidentified dead, meaning they may have been swept out to sea and lost forever. The true death toll has never been established. It could be anywhere from 141 to 148. In the days that followed, the government of Benin declared 3 days of national mourning. President Matthew Karakou personally visited the crash site. United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan issued a statement expressing condolences, particularly for the 15 Bangladeshi peacekeepers who had survived their deployment only to die on the flight home. On December 28th, a French military aircraft carried 77 Lebanese coffins and 2 Iranian coffins from Cotonou to Beirut, where a repatriation ceremony was held in the presence of President Emile Lahoud, Prime Minister Rafik Hariri, and Speaker of the House Nabi Berri. For Lebanon, the crash was a national tragedy. 122 of the dead held Lebanese or French-Lebanese nationality. For Benin, it was the worst aviation disaster in the country's history, and the first major accident its investigators had ever faced. The country did not have the expertise to conduct the probe, which is why the technical investigation was delegated entirely to the French BEA. The BEA investigation that followed was scathing. Investigators described UTA as a company that only half existed, flying an airplane with no verifiable history, operated by a crew whose qualifications were unverifiable, on a flight with no manifest, resulting in a crash that killed dozens. The report used the word apparently 8 times, the only word adequate for describing an organization built on fiction. The BEA identified a direct cause: the crew's difficulty performing rotation on an overloaded airplane whose forward center of gravity was unknown to them, and 2 structural causes: UTA's serious lack of competence, organization, and regulatory documentation, and the inadequacy of the supervision exercised by the Ghanaian civil aviation authorities. There were no criminal convictions that stuck initially, no lawsuits that held, no enforcement from Guinea. The paper trail led into shell companies designed to dissolve on contact. But in October 2010, a Lebanese court sentenced Captain al-Barouni to 20 years in prison for neglect. Imad Saba, the UTA general manager, and the UTA operations chief received sentences ranging from 3 months to 3 years. All were ordered to pay a combined $930,000 in compensation to the victims' families, a sum that worked out to roughly $6,500 per life lost. The BEA's recommendations reached all the way to ICAO, calling for clearer responsibilities for member states regarding licensing and oversight. If states without regulatory capacity were permitted to certify airlines unchecked, the report argued, it could undermine the entire foundation of international aviation cooperation, which rests on trust in each nation's ability to oversee its own operators. The report also recommended that the FAA and European EASA support the development of autonomous onboard systems for measuring weight and balance. Systems that would remove the human element from a calculation that, on this flight, was never performed at all. The first officer of UTA Flight 141 knew. He did not suspect. He did not worry. Quietly, he said it out loud, into a cockpit voice recorder, in front of the airline's director general. "We're going to drop into the sea." He proposed a solution: offload the baggage. He was overruled. He had no contract, no union, no manual to cite, no regulation to invoke, no authority behind him except the truth. And the truth, in a system built to ignore it, was not enough. 70 seconds after brake release, the aircraft did exactly what he said it would do. It dropped into the sea. The captain survived. The flight engineer survived. The director general survived. The first officer, the only person in that cockpit who spoke the truth, did not. The next time someone complains about the abundance of rules in aviation, about the red tape, the checklists, the paperwork, the load sheets that have to be signed before every door closes, remember UTA Flight 141. Remember that every one of those rules exists because somewhere, once, there was a flight where that rule did not exist. And remember the first officer who knew exactly what was going to happen, said it clearly, and died anyway. Because in a system with no rules, being right is not enough to save your life. If that thought stays with you, consider subscribing, because in the next episode, we will examine a different kind of failure, where the rules existed, but the people trusted to enforce them looked the other way.